Hi, everybody. Nice to see you. I am going to put a Jamboard into the chat over here, and everybody should have access to that. So as they mentioned in our big session, we are going to be talking about 3 different big questions. And I know that the last time that we met, it was really helpful for people to be able to record as well as for us to talk out loud. Stephen, again, is going to be taking notes for us this evening, but we also have the opportunity for folks to record their own notes. And so the very first question that we're going to be looking at, as everybody has hopped in there. And let me toggle over. So the very first prompt is, what in the recommendation do you support? And you'll notice that you have room to respond to that on the Jamboard. If you're not super familiar with Jamboard, you have a lot of buttons over on the left. You can do a sticky note. That's the 4th one down. Just click on it. You can write on that. You can also write with a pen.
View only.
Sorry, what's that?
It's view only for me.
Okay, it should be, let me go back to it. 1 second. It may be, oh, I think Stephen's fixing it for us right now. Now you should be good.
Yeah, you may have to refresh and then try again.
And Stephen, since you're sharing your screen, do you want to, I see that you were showing where to do the post-it, how you can edit, etc. You can change your colors if you want to. So I figured we'd take a couple minutes just to write anything that you want to share on the Jamboard. We can also, Stephen, maybe if you want to also drop the note sheet in there in case people just feel more comfortable like typing into a table. That's another way to do it. So you can feel free to share your thoughts either way, and then we'll take the next 18 minutes after that to talk about what you support in this proposal. So we'll take until about 6:51 just to record your thoughts. And you can also just drag and drop your post-its. So if you accidentally type on top of someone else's, just pull it over. And we're going to take about 1 more minute. And I know we had somebody in the group last week that said, hey, I actually process better talking. That's totally fine. We're trying to provide as many different opportunities for people to process and think through and share their recommendations as possible. So if you're not ready to write anything yet, maybe just use this time to look through the packet a little bit more. We'll take about 20 more seconds for people to write, and then we'll talk. So I see that several different people have said that they think that the conversion of Lent, Marysville, and Arleta is positive. Consolidation of DLI programming at Kellogg. Like the schools are moving together, neighborhood and DLI, although that wouldn't be true for Atkinson. flexibility for addressing Franklin's enrollment, utilization level that allows flexibility for enrollment bump. Are there folks who'd like to speak aloud about things they support or about any questions they have around whether something should be supported or not? Again, we have until about 7:10 to discuss this portion.
Can someone just clarify for me the Atkinson situation? I know this creates a split feeder, but which part stays and which part goes?
DLI would go to Kellogg. So the Spanish DLI would join the other Spanish DLIs from the other schools at Kellogg.
And then where would the Atkinson students go?
The neighborhood students?
Yeah.
Can anybody else answer that? I need to go back to the...
Tabor.
Yeah, they
Tabor.
stay at Mark
Tabor.
Tabor.
Okay. And that gets to the split.
The Tabor assignment. And it does split Bridger as well, but the difference is we don't have a middle school assignment currently.
Right. Okay, thank you.
And Sabrina, this is Misha. I was thinking too, because it's at 80%, thinking about Creston and, where the Atkinson, why wouldn't they also go to Kellogg? But I'm thinking that I also read that they want to put 3 focus classrooms at Kellogg. So I don't know if they're saving space for that. I don't know if anyone else knows.
I do not know.
I know that was part of one of the additional considerations that was in the packet was around building that special ed continuum for the region. And so I don't think those numbers are like part of the 80%. So it would be like within that.
Do we know what really Kellogg's best operating capacity is? I understood 80% is what we were going for across all schools, but is that accurate?
Yes. And back to the special education question, it's at the bottom of page 4. So it says the special education department indicated that there will be at least 1 special education focused classroom in addition to learning center supports. But in future years, the department will need space for 3 focused classrooms.
Okay.
And so that's part of the reason for limitations on enrollment.
So is this then Kellogg is at max capacity at 80%?
No, I mean, 80% is 80%. So the idea is to have some flexibility as the neighborhood fluctuates, as there's inevitably more enrollment in the school than we think there's going to be based on the numbers that we have right now, because people do shift and move and things like that.
I think it's also...
let me just clarify that our modernized schools, we expect to operate really efficiently. And a lot of those efficiencies are already built into our utilization model. The holding to 80% to start up is because virtually every one of the schools that we've opened in the past several years has had a new school effect, more students than we can plan for. And in some cases, if you were around in 2016, when we opened Ockley Green very quickly, it led to some pretty chaotic and not positive experiences for students and staff for most of that first year. So we're really trying to avoid that by asking for a buffer, particularly for this first year.
Judy, is that what also happened at Franklin?
Yes. The difference with Franklin is that we, yes, there were definitely, yes.
And Logan is saying in the chat, not good. I would like to see that be avoided. Do you mean over enrollment, Logan?
Yeah, the situation that happened at Ockley was terrible.
Yeah.
Well, can you guys say a little more about that? Because I don't really know what you mean. Did people end up going to Ockley that weren't really supposed to?
No, I mean, there were a lot of students that were not enrolled in neighborhood schools at that time, like that they had made other choices or not enrolled in their neighborhood school. And so then that decided, oh, great, we have a middle school in our neighborhood now. We're going to come back to the neighborhood school that is assigned to me in my neighborhood boundary, but I wasn't accessing before. And there was probably more students too that we couldn't account for from charter schools or homeschooled or private schools that aren't even on the
Right.
radar.
There also are sometimes some people who discover addresses that
Right.
happen to be in the location of the newly opened school. And that is also an issue, although we try to make sure that we're verifying where folks live and, be fair about that. That is something that comes up.
The key distinction between, say, a Franklin High School that has an intact population, they've moved off-site, they've got an intact leadership system, teachers, supports, then they move and people rediscover their real address and come back to the school, but it's an intact entity. When you're creating a middle school in the first year and you're blending staff from multiple schools, students and families from different places, bringing them together under new leadership, and you've got many more students than were planned for, it's just, it's not the best way to start off and assure success.
Dee is pointing out in the chat that Madison may experience a similar bump in enrollment, and so that may kind of change how we should think about phase 2 decisions. Somebody wrote on the JAM board that it leaves space to integrate full community feedback, including schools who weren't present in phase 1, so that phase 2 can be more comprehensive. And someone else had written about flexibility for addressing Franklin's enrollment. And Director Bailey is pointing out that the Madison bump may be less because of adjacent high schools having been rebuilt. Are there other things that folks would like to talk about in terms of what you are finding to support here? We have about 12 more minutes for that part of it before we move on to other prompts.
I know there was support for 20-minute, but if we don't have more, can we start our time on other things?
Yep, absolutely. I just want to make sure that we're not missing anything, or if somebody's a little bit more hesitant to jump in, that they've had a chance to.
I'd like to pose a question, and I texted Claire. I don't know if I'm supposed to, I really want to be more observer, but it's a data question about, we have an initial estimated enrollment for Kellogg at about 80%. But that's based on the current feeder enrollment, I believe. And if we change boundaries in phase 2 so that those feeders have a larger cohort of K-5, that will increase students feeding into Kellogg in subsequent years.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know if we had an estimate on that, or what if the feeders as proposed in the scenario were at 85%, what would that do to the Kellogg enrollment?
Rachel is here from Flow. Rachel, is that something that you can pull for us?
Yeah, if you just give me 1 second, I can look into that.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Does anybody else have anything that you want to talk about in terms of what you support in the recommendation, or anything that you had questions about before we move on to the second piece, which is what would you change?
I have a question.
Go for it.
What's the threshold for whole schools getting free lunch?
I think right now it's 60. Is it, Judy? You might be able to do that. It's high. It's like 60%.
I think it's 65.
We can get the exact number for you.
We can look at that, but it's actually shifted during the pandemic. So there's actually a lower threshold available during the pandemic than it was in the last school year.
What is it currently, Judy? Do you have that?
I'm looking it up.
Great, thanks.
Isn't that also something that is kind of up to the district to adjust?
Yes.
Not the whole school free meals. That's a federal certification program.
But the definition of what qualifies as low income for some measures depends on district determination.
Yeah.
And is it the same at middle school and elementary and middle school for the whole school certification is my other piece of that.
Let me see what I can find out for you.
Director Bailey, if I was understanding your question correctly, looking at the numbers, it looks like The total number of students in grades 5, 6, and 7 currently for the neighborhood program would be about 414 students. And then the DLI program bringing in about 250. Depending on how boundaries change, again, that could change the numbers, and we can see how that goes in phase 2. But does that answer what you were asking?
No, my question was more, if we change the boundaries for, let's see, Lent, Arleta, and Marysville, so that they were at 85% capacity for their K-5 programs.
Okay.
Then how would that change the numbers, the incoming 6th graders?
Got it. So you'd want to see each of those elementary schools at 85% capacity, and then what that means at the middle school level.
As a what if, because that impacts when we're talking about how much room do we have for the future, what kind of flexibility do we have around Creston? If it turns out that we boost those numbers like we want, then maybe we don't have that much wiggle room after all.
Right.
And I think that would be an important thing for the committee to consider as we talk this through.
Okay.
Is there anything else? Oh, go ahead. Is there anything else that folks want to bring up in terms of things that you do support from this proposal?
Well, I'll say I put the piece about flexibility for addressing Franklin's enrollment, and this is one that I do support it in this proposal because, I mean, this is something that I wish that we were able to talk about it all in conjunction with Harrison Park and the entire region, because it is a really difficult one, because that flexibility comes in the form of leaving Creston out of this proposal. So I think it's really difficult, but I think that flexibility is really important, and it's one of the things that I want to be able to really fully evaluate what our Franklin feeder pattern might be and what schools we're going to prioritize, and really hear from those communities, have full representation, and be able to use an equity lens. So while the impact is great on the Creston community for the next year, I do think that flexibility in this proposal is valuable.
Thank you. And I see that somebody wrote Lent, Arleta, and Marysville initial assignment fulfills our commitment to prioritizing the RESJ lens. Does the person who wrote that want to say more about that piece?
Sorry, that was me, Dee. I think that in the discussions about what schools get prioritized for Kellogg and what don't, I was just happy to see that Lentz stayed in that grouping at the get-go.
And can you say a little bit more about what you see as being in line with racial equity and social justice in terms of those particular schools feeding to Kellogg?
I will. It's uncomfortable because I don't want to diminish the value of Creston's input and their sort of disappointment in not being included in this process. I think I agree with every single thing that was in the letter that they put forward. I just think that when we talk about communities that are historically underserved, I think just this process has showed us how historically underserved Lentz is. I feel like from the get-go, we've talked about that program like it's less than undesirable, both in location and in performance. And I just think that if the purpose of this endeavor is to create true change, that we have to really honor what that looks like, to have programs like that actually have improvement, and I think like the very first person that talked at the very first meeting was a parent from Lentz, and she was just very emotional about feeling like they're always left out of any sort of like good or positive change that happens in the district. And so, like, personally, it was just really nice to see, it seemed like as a coalition as a whole, their place was preserved with that aspect.
Thank you.
But we also talked in our small group about the fact that none of this is set in stone, and once we see the bigger picture of the whole Southeast cluster, that things might have to switch around, and trying to leave some space for that. And, you know, one thing we had talked about with the DLI program was that the consolidation is really positive, but more importantly, if it needs to be changed, I feel like creating that consolidation at the middle school level makes it easier to move a whole program with a little bit more integrity. So that was another piece that I saw that was positive about how that played out.
Thank you. And in case people missed it, Judy had written in the chat that the 3 proposed Kellogg neighborhood feeders, Arleta, there we go, Lent and Marysville all qualify for direct certification this year, but we don't know exactly what that percentage was. And Rachel was sharing with Director Bailey that we could expect around 520 students from those schools if it was filled to 85% capacity, including modulars. Anything else that folks would like to talk about in terms of things that you support here or questions that you have before we move on? Okay, then I'd like to invite you to go ahead and go on to that second Jamboard slide. So again, if you're not super familiar with Jamboard, you'll notice at the top of your screen that you have a 1 of 7, and you can click to the right on the arrow to go to 2 of 7. And Stephen, maybe you could present for a second so that folks can see it. And the second question is, what would you change? And so I see Andrea saying that it would be great to know what enrollment numbers are at 80, 85, and 90% for Kellogg. Rachel, would you mind pulling those for us? And let's do the same thing that we did before. So let's take 2 minutes. And again, if you don't like to process by writing on your own, that's totally fine. Maybe if you just want to spend a little bit more time looking at the proposal in that case. If you do want to make some comments here about what you would change, feel free to go ahead and do that on the Jamboard, and then we'll talk about it together. And Beth is asking, adding SI is about 238 more.
Where's my, I can't find my, oh, I'm not muted. Okay.
Sorry. No, you're not. What is it?
I'm asking, I was in reference to what Rachel shared for Scott, that the 520 neighborhood students, then if Spanish immersion was also remaining at Kellogg, that would be about, according to that chart that was in the slideshow, about 238 students on top of that, 520 from the neighborhood schools?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
The boundaries have not changed, correct? So that with Kellogg sitting in the Bridger neighborhood or Bridger district or feeder area, none of those houses immediately adjacent to Kellogg are feeding to Kellogg. It's all south of Powell at this point. Is that, plus the DLI programs, is that correct?
I need to look back at the proposal. Can anyone else find the place that it addresses that?
That's correct.
I would imagine we're going to see some pressure on that boundary as well then to the north of Kellogg.
So page 3 in the proposal shares that all K-5 attendance boundaries remain unchanged for 2021 and 22, and that we'll consider boundary changes during phase 2.
Yeah, so I guess my point is that I have a feeling that it will be hard to just have people with a school sitting in their neighborhood not tweak the boundaries a little bit to give some more accessibility.
Where do those kids presently go?
Bridger mostly, and Atkinson. It's right on the corner of the boundary of Atkinson and Bridger. It sits squarely, it's in Bridger, but on the, I guess it's the southwest boundary of Bridger in the corner, and then right next to Atkinson.
Rachel might be able to pull up the web map as well. That would give you the visual.
Yeah, would it be helpful if I shared my screen? I have the web map pulled up actually.
Oh, that'd be great.
Yeah.
Going back to the idea of redrawing the school boundaries to increase enrollment, I would imagine that possibly Marysville would get drawn, or, you know, some of those, if Bridger doesn't have a neighborhood program anymore, I would imagine our southern portion that's south of Division would get absorbed by between Marysville and Lentz.
Right.
And Judy's writing in the chat that it looks like the direct certification rate to qualify for 100% free meals is less than 20 for elementary and middle, but greater for high school.
Thanks.
And Judy, can you explain for folks what is different about direct certification versus family application?
Yeah, so if you qualify for government assistance, meal assistance, and obviously during the pandemic, there's many, many more people who've qualified for that assistance, then your qualification automatically qualifies your child for free meals. So we call that direct certification because a family doesn't have to do any additional paperwork. It comes directly from the federal, from the state government into the PPS system so that we can make sure that kids get those meals. And then when a certain proportion of kids in a whole school are qualify for direct certification, then the entire school is eligible for free meals regardless of their home income status. And there are significantly more schools who fall into that category this year, in part because of so many families who are qualifying for assistance during the pandemic.
So I see that we have a few comments so far on the Jamboard. 2 of them are about Creston. One talks about empathizing with Creston's situation and feeling that the reality of a small K-8 is not good for students, and can we see what it would take to move Creston? Another one says convert Creston in 2021 for students to have a comprehensive middle school experience. And then the third comment is suggesting that PPS work with the Bridger neighborhood families in the current middle school cohort to figure out the interim assignment before we get to their long-term feeder. Do folks want to respond or talk on those?
Well, I love having, I forget her name, the woman from Flow. Where'd she go on my screen?
Rachel.
Rachel. I would love a Rachel in my daily life just to ask data questions to. Rachel, is it possible to see, you know, if the Creston Middle School is pretty small, if that middle school went to Kellogg, how much that bumps up the utilization percentage?
Yeah, let's see. It looks like Creston would add around 134 students based on their current 5th, 6th, and 7th graders.
It's bigger than I thought, actually.
Yeah, let's see.
That's why I was asking about the 80, 85, and 90%, so we could just simply look at those numbers and know what it pops it up to.
Yeah, that's why I'm most curious about Creston's.
So I added the 80 and 90% to the chat.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
And there's also another comment on the Jamboard about being worried that how all of Lint DLI will need to be bused, but the other DLI will not need to be bused.
Judy, do you know Creston's total middle school population numbers off the top of your head, or do you have them? 134 is not a number I expected for 2 grades. That's big.
It's 3 grades.
I know, but she just said current 6th and 7th grade makes 134.
5th, 6th, and 7th graders make 134.
Right. So what's their total middle school population number? I'm just curious, like trying to figure out this, like, because when I say small, as a principal, I was thinking under 100 in middle school or 110, but are they like at 200 middle schoolers at Creston?
No, but she's giving you the numbers that would roll up for next year.
Right.
Right. What if it were 6th, 7th, and 8th?
Yeah.
You want the current 6th, 7th, and 8th?
No, that's 5th, 6th, and 7th makes 134. That's what you mean? Okay.
Yes.
Got it. Okay. That makes more sense. Thanks.
Okay.
That's in that really cool chart that Beth presented as well.
Okay.
Oh, cool. Okay.
But that's what I'm trying to figure out is if we added Creston, what would and I think maybe, Rachel, you might have misunderstood me because you said Andrew with modulars around 488. I'm talking about Kellogg and what is 80% at Kellogg and what is 85% at Kellogg.
Okay.
Because I'm interested myself in like looking at what happens if Creston is added, because it is horribly unfair that they're not, but it makes sense from a project planning standpoint. And also like if we were to eliminate a split feeder at Atkinson, what would that populate Kellogg to? And then there's all these boundary changes that will likely be happening too. as
What,
Director Bailey said. And
What happens to enrollment at Creston when the middle school leaves? What building utilization are they at?
it's
For-
low to begin with.
For the elementary school?
Yep, yep.
So that's option A. I think you would see that, Rachel. I don't know if you have.
So
And stuff up here. I think.
there's a lot in the chat also if folks are not following. So Beth had mentioned that adding Creston to the current option C brings it to about 92%, and wondering if there's a middle school close enough to Lent that they wouldn't have to be bused. But then also pointing out that Harrison Park is 2 miles away, which would also require a bus. And Harrison Park and Lent currently bus a good number of students. Somebody else had asked about Atkinson and avoiding a split. And I wonder what the rationale is in terms of like whether there's Spanish DLI both at Mount Tabor and at Kellogg or only at Kellogg, and if there's a good argument for one versus the other. Like if you continued this current pattern for Atkinson students and all went to Mount Tabor,
Right.
would that then free up enough space for Creston? And is there a good reason to not do that and to send Atkinson to Kellogg?
Which takes care of that split feeder too.
But
So I do wonder about that from a staffing perspective. So if we continue with one strand of Spanish immersion at Mount Tabor and the remaining all at Kellogg, I'm wondering about, so first of all, just staff isolation, and do we have when I did some just back of envelope calculations looking at just sort of the numbers of students in each grade from all of those programs together, and it seems like having 4 strands come to middle school gives a pretty consistent 3 strands per grade level at the middle school level, whereas if you have 3 programs coming into one building and 1 in another, or even if you have a 2 and 2 split, you really lose a lot of that efficiency in terms of being able to deal with fluctuations at grade levels, because like Bridger has a random class of only 12 kids, and these things are easier to balance out when you've got everything in one place. And then you have the same number of staff every year. It's not like, well, this year we only need 1 6th grade teacher and this year we need 2. So that was another piece to that that's more on the logistic end rather than the instructional or student end.
I think that in my experience with this whole process, what you just articulated is so much of the tension, because we could say, are we going to make the decision based on DLI or based on neighborhood, right? Like Creston or Atkinson, and they both have pros and cons. Which leads me to not know what to do.
Yeah, and I'll look at the numbers so that we can see like just what really would that trade-off be in terms of enrollment if the Atkinson DLI was.
It's 60 something. It's not. It's
yeah.
DLI isn't terribly high. But I mean, here's if you. I mean, there's not room at Tabor to add 2 strands of Spanish immersion. I think we owe it to the students that if we're bringing them out of the elementary level, that they're at least going into 2, if not 4 strands. Some of that conversation was, could it take place at Bridger, but there was strong resistance from the Lent community to move to Bridger. And part of that is that, and this is the same as Lane, is that we're dealing with 2 schools which maybe in reality, perhaps it's only perception, are seen as lesser than Kellogg, because Kellogg is a brand new school. So it's shiny and attractive. Does that mean that good programs and quality education couldn't take place at Bridger and at Harrison Park and at Lane? I don't know.
There's also, so there are a lot of numbers in the chat, and then there's also the fact that there's an issue, potential issue, both at Mount Tabor, an existing issue in terms of utilization versus the potential issue at Kellogg in terms of percent of utilization.
I mean, it doesn't escape me that Lane's sitting there behind all 3 of these areas with 165 seats in it as a middle school.
And I think in the case of the Spanish at Kellogg, it's important to remember that these aren't 200 kids that are out of the neighborhood. I mean, Bridger is in Kellogg's draw. A good portion of it is actually south of Tabor. If you look at our address distribution, I mean, one of the biggest issues that we have at Bridger is we don't retain a lot of our higher SES families to the school. like the portion of Tabor that is between Division and Stark.
Oh, Dee, we lost you for a second.
Uh-oh.
She's frozen. I never know what to do when people say like you're frozen. Like what should Dee do? Unfreeze herself. Ugh.
Turn your video off.
Turn your video, yeah, turn your video off and just go audio, Dee.
That's why my video is never on.
That's a good idea, yeah. I could do that too.
Ah, she's unfrozen.
I'm unfrozen.
Dee,
Welcome
we lost
back.
the second part of what you're saying.
Oh, I was just gonna sort of reiterate that Bridger, you know, our school is in such a weird spot. And one thing that the Bridger school has really struggled with is we don't retain a lot of our high SES families that are in that neighborhood boundary that are sort of the east side of Tabor. If you look at, there's a distribution map earlier of like where families lived, and most of the families that are sort of between Division and Stark actually are either at CSS or in a private school. And so a lot of our enrollment actually is in fact between Division and Powell. And so for those kids, if Marysville, Arleta, and Lentz get redrawn to have bigger boundaries and Bridger no longer has a neighborhood, those kids will naturally be part of that neighborhood draw anyway. So it's sort of a discussion that I've had with Jed a lot about just, you know, there's sort of logistics around what actually happens as compared to the numbers, and they're not always separate.
Yeah.
Something else to consider is that probably one DLI program or another is going to be affected, whether it's Spanish DLI or Chinese DLI, depending on where Creston goes. Because if Creston feeds to Hosford, it likely creates a situation with a Chinese DLI or a potential for looking at movement there, at least based on what we saw in the recommendations. If Creston goes to Kellogg, then it probably impacts Spanish DLI.
Is it, this is so not my comfort. So I feel like tonight I'm just going to ask everything, even though it doesn't make me look super smart. Is it like not an option to have Kellogg at 92%? Like to have Creston just say, we want everything the way it is now and Creston?
It could happen, but it's problematic in that we know that almost certainly then it will be way over enrolled because we know that we need to leave a margin for people coming in that we don't anticipate right now, but that we know will happen based on what we've seen in the previous schools. And we don't want to set it up for that situation.
Yeah, like, I mean, I can say just anecdotally, I know several families in the Foster Powell neighborhood, you know, spread across Creston, Arleta, Marysville, who specifically ended up having to pull their kids from the middle school program because it wasn't working for them.
Right.
But if Kellogg is on the table, they're probably going to come back.
Yeah.
Right. And also, I mean, I have a friend whose child started middle school at Ockley Green when it opened, and you know had been a student at Beach and was very excited for their own, you know, for their neighborhood middle school. And it like they spent about 6 weeks in absolute chaos with no social studies class assigned, and then with 45 kids in the social studies class, and then with it, and like they ended up pulling their kids and going to private school, and they were super brokenhearted about it. But it was like a really miserable opening with how much chaos came from that.
Yeah. So the answer is really no. Like we don't want to be in the 90s.
Why people think that Lane cannot be on the table to solve this issue, have all the KA convert? I mean, can't Lane provide the middle school experience that's needed? If not, I think that's a big issue that we need to address. Because I'm hearing like where everyone wants to be in Kellogg, and we have Lane sitting right there. I mean, Arleta, one side is, it's right next to Kellogg, but on the other side, you know, the border, south border is at Duke, which is where basically cross the park from Lane, where Lane is. So I don't know why we're holding up Creston from being converted and put the kids in a comprehensive middle school. But and then we're told in there, no, you cannot. We have to wait until make room in another middle school while we have school that have room.
Min, can I ask a clarifying question? Yeah. Are you saying that if we took this proposal right now and said Creston would go to Lane, or who?
Not Creston. I mean, Arleta.
Arleta would go to Lane.
And we don't know what the boundary we draw would be like second phase. So, I mean, right now, what do we see as it sits currently, it's one end is in, reach Kellogg, and the other end is Lane.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's more Woodstock, really, isn't it? The actual boundaries as they stand right now.
Yeah, it is a weird boundary for Woodstock.
Yeah, so I mean, I think first of all, we can't use Lane next fall because access won't be out yet, is my understanding. They won't be out until at least winter break.
So
I
see, oh, sorry, go ahead.
It would be on, Lane will be more on the table for boundary discussions, I think, after access moves out and we're actually moving some lines around. At least that's kind of my understanding.
So what I see right now, gosh, so what is last year? I don't have this year's enrollment, but last year it's 590. So the capacity, full capacity is, where is it? 749 without modulus, I believe.
So Lane's principal.
Yeah, maybe Michael can provide some input in this.
Yeah, I wish I had more of an update. It's not clear what the status of the move is right now, but I know that they're still looking at a potential location for the Access Academy move and doing some really early planning around architectural change. I know that there's a current school in that location that needs to find a new home also. There's a kind of a number of dominoes that need to fall to set that up, and that certainly is not going to be in line for the coming school year, as far as I understand it. So I think Lane's increase in enrollment will have to wait for phase 2 and can't be factored into phase 1, as far as I know at this point.
Thanks, Mike. To confirm, in fact, the school board just the other day voted to an early termination of the lease at Terwilliger. And so that starts the access move in motion, but the program will not be able to move. There just isn't enough time to get the building ready. So it'll probably be a mid-year move, which means that that space at Lane would be available beginning in 2022. And Mike, do you feel that Lane could house another feeder school, have another K-5 feeder?
Yeah, I think that's, looking at the numbers, I think that's very possible. I think it's also possible to look at redrawing some boundaries for a number of the K-5, the new K-5s in the area. So I think there are options there for sure.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Rachel, would you mind putting the map up just so that folks can see again kind of where things are in relation to each other?
Okay. Can folks see it?
Putting the link in the chat too.
Thanks.
Can you make it a little bit bigger?
So one of the things that we talked about at the last meeting was only having 2 schools feed to Kellogg. And as we talk about boundary changes to the south and what probably will have to happen to the north. And I mean, maybe we're not preserving enough options right now by taking capacity to 80%. Maybe we should be considering a lower capacity. Maybe just, for instance, Lent and Marysville feeding to Kellogg.
So I know that the goal is to get between 60 and 80%.
So I'm confused about where this 80% is coming from, because in table 1 on page 3, it says 70.9%.
Let me go there. Table 1 on page 3. And so which part of the table are you reading?
At the bottom for Kellogg, where it has the enrollment utilization estimate.
And so what I was trying to share a second ago is that the goal is to have it between 60 and 80%. And so it falls right smack in the middle of that at 70.9.
And I think with Bridger's updated numbers, it's actually more like 75 point, 75%, right? That was in the table that was shared in the slide deck, 75.7.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
So I'm wondering if we have any consensus around things that we would like to see changed. It sounds like there's some wonderings around boundaries that will likely be considered in phase 2, and there's some wonderings about Creston and what's going to happen with Creston.
I think when I'm reading, so my question is that if the suggestion, if what we would change is ensuring that Creston also had a middle school in 2021, what does that alternate proposal look like? Because we've looking at the numbers, and just adding Creston to this proposal sounds like that is not feasible in terms of Kellogg's numbers. So what would be the trade-off then?
Spanish immersion would need to not be placed at Kellogg.
All Spanish immersion?
Yep.
So then what happens to Bridger next year? Because they don't fit in their building.
What happens to the Lent single strand of DLI?
And the Lent single strand of DLI.
So, so I guess what I have to, I mean, I don't want to do that. I'm
just saying we need to follow those threads, because like just saying remove Spanish immersion means, okay, well, so then what? Because there's those pieces that are in this proposal that would need to, you know, have a alternative for it.
Right, and if there weren't any K-8 conversions this year because we said, you know, it's with coronavirus, we're moving too fast, we need to give it a year and properly plan with drawing new boundaries and things like that, would the Creston community be as upset as they are with the fact that they're being slighted by not being included in this year's K-8 conversion? And that, which is why I'm wondering whether because hearing Director Bailey talk about boundary changes, looking at boundary changes that may need to happen, looking at the likely increase in enrollment, which is unpredictable from the placement of a brand new school that everybody wants to go to, I'm hedging towards even more frugal than 80%, and which is why I said Lent and Marysville, we could get them there this year. We know that they would almost in every circumstance go to Kellogg, and then figure out Creston in our letter, which would give us more freedom in terms of boundaries, changing boundaries next year, because it seems obvious that these schools aren't populated enough. Boundaries do need to be changed. There's a whole question going on around Lane, Woodstock, Lewis, and there's the question of the Chinese immersion program, which I almost feel like we could make a guarantee to the Chinese community to preserve their program to Hosford and to Cleveland. But that would then limit Creston's options come next year. So all of that points to me to say, be conservative, not, that's it.
So there's a couple pieces. One, we have the director of dual language immersion in the room with us. And so Michael, I wonder if you want to say anything about the benefit of one strand versus many strands, and if, you know, one is completely problematic or not problematic. The other thing is that we haven't yet moved on to our third prompt, and we do want to make sure also that we have time for that. So the third thing that we're asked to consider is, what should the group do during phase 2 in terms of what are the priorities? So if you want to start adding some thoughts to the Jamboard, also while we continue discussing this current question, feel free to do that.
Also, just real quick as a time reminder, they want us to come back to the main room in 10 minutes at 7:45, which will leave time for some share outs, and then we'll have a break at 8:05.
Michael, is there anything that you could say in perhaps, 30 seconds to a minute about DLI?
Everything about DLI in 30 seconds.
Yeah, go.
Obviously, and I know this is going to be a deeper dive for us, and we're going to come back in phase 2 around some of those things, but obviously from a robust program offering, having those converge, those 4 strands or converge at one school makes programming a lot better and a lot more robust. And I think someone mentioned about, if you're a single teacher and we have any fluctuation, and they have to sort of be jack of all trades. And so our ability to deliver the programming they want to close the opportunity gap for our emergent bilingual children's is reduced. The only difference I would say is that with immersion, we can tend to have better stability in numbers, right? So if you do have one strand like Atkinson going to Mount Tabor, that can be a little more stable population. I think we've been somewhat successful at Mount Tabor. Tanya is new there and probably maybe doesn't have the longer term experience, but may be able to speak to that a little bit. But my worry is Mount Tabor is potentially going off to Madison. That takes it further away. They would have to come back in. So I guess those are my initial thoughts, and certainly able to put more out if we have more time.
Thank you, Michael. And just noting for us on the Jamboard too, that we do, that third slide is challenges and potential solutions. So if you see any solutions to location of Bridger neighborhood 6-8, Creston remaining at K8, Atkinson split feeder, and Chinese DLI staying in place, feel free to add those there. As well as to slide 4, which is what would you add to the phase 2 priorities. So I invite folks to talk about either of those two things right now, like again, about what do you want to see change, or that may impact what should our priorities be in the next phase as well.
I'm going to echo. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I want to echo what Michael said in regards to robust programming about having multiple strands of DLI together. I think we do serve students better. I think it's better on staff as well. In thinking, like, I recognize that the building that I serve in as principal at Mount Tabor is already over capacity. I'm also trying to be mindful and looking at the numbers there too. If we know that offering a more robust DLI program with all strands of our Spanish DLI converging at one school, that does free up some of the space. And I know Bridger is looking for a 1 year, where do we go from here middle school solution. The number of students is about 3 kiddos difference between our Spanish immersion strands right now at Tabor and Bridger's current, or what they're anticipating their 6-8 enrollment could be. It could be a temporary, like 1 year holding space if we're looking for a location for the Bridger community that's not completely geographically distant. But I wanted to throw that out there as a possibility.
Thanks. There's some conversation in the chat about Bridger and how could we move Bridger if we're being conservative. Judy's wondering how people feel about options for the neighborhood 6-8 in terms of moving to Harrison Park, moving to Kellogg, offering choice. And then Stephen is reminding folks to contribute on the Jamboard.
Are you guys, no one really likes the idea of just reducing enrollment at Kellogg this year to just Lent and Marysville and the Spanish immersion program?
I don't. I'll say. I'm not in favor of that.
I'm not either.
Can you say why, Beth?
Well, I think that for me, it's when I look at the only reason to me, or a main reason I would say for Creston to not be included, is because there is a potential that Creston's feeder path could impact Franklin's enrollment. That same impact doesn't exist for Arleta. It wouldn't make sense for them to feed anywhere other than Franklin. So even if the middle school feeder pattern did change, like that Lane was a potential middle school feeder for Arleta, it doesn't help with the Franklin concern. And so in that case, I say, I am more comfortable assigning Arleta and making sure that we can get more neighborhood middle school students or K-8 students into the middle school right away as possible. And, you know, not that, like, this isn't part of the planning, and ideally this is all, any school we assign to Kellogg is a long-term assignment. But, you know, if it really came down to it and there had to be phase 2 changes, that I still think it would be worth it to assign Arleta in that case to Kellogg next year. And I appreciate you asking that, because I think that is something we skip over a lot of time, is just not explaining our reasoning. And so happy to do that.
Thank you. And Logan's pointing out in the chat that under enrolling Kellogg would have a negative impact on staffing and services.
So one thing I don't quite understand is why, if a feeder feeds to Kellogg and it has to go to Franklin, I mean, is that that kind of like a guidance we have, you know, whoever goes to Kellogg is gotta go to Franklin, because I kind of feel like we kind of confine ourselves in that. Like, okay, you can't, if you're not gonna, you go to Cleveland, so you can't go to Kellogg, because I don't really see that's the reason that we not feeding Kristen to Kellogg.
That's a really good point, Min. And it's actually, I hadn't really put those things together until I think you mentioned something about that on Discord this week. And so I do appreciate that. And that's a really good point. I still think that when you put it together with the overcrowding issues, that it's like a twofold thing for Creston. But you're right. If we were to assign Creston to Kellogg, that doesn't mean that we can't consider that as a split feeder if that's necessary. So that's really, thank you for pointing that out.
Judy, can you speak to that piece at all in terms of high school assignment from the middle school?
She's right. I mean, there's no rule. Many people speak to the benefit of having all your middle schoolers go together to one high school, but we have Lane is a split middle. The kids go off to 2 high schools. I think Mike has experienced this, and Tabor is a split as well, with some kids going to Grant and some to Franklin. So we do have it in other places, and we'd like to have the least amount of it possible. But it's not, you know, this is all about trade-offs. It's all about risk versus benefit. Is 85% too much if you give opportunity to other kids, or is it too big of a risk? Like this is just all part of what makes it challenging.
Thank you. And so we have 2 minutes left before we get pulled back to the big group. I think my question is there anything that we definitely want to see change, or is it really more about things that need to be urgently addressed in the second phase?
I mean,
I'm still uncomfortable with the whole Creston thing, but I don't have a solution for it. So
thank you.
Sabrina, would you be comfortable with higher enrollment at Kellogg, even up closer to 100%? You
know, I don't know. I mean, I understand all the reasons why not to do that. I just, as I shared earlier somewhere, you know, I feel like I experienced what Creston's going to experience when I went to Vestal, and those kids already knew they were only going to be there 1 year, and everybody who could have gotten out did get out. And it was a terrible setup for those kids. And I know that's only 1 year, but I also, like, one of my things as an educator is you only have 1 7th grade year, and 7th grade is awkward enough, right? You only have 1 of every year. So if there's any possible way to fix it, but I don't know. I don't know if I feel like, is that worth 92%? I'm not, I don't know.
Dee is pointing out that there are 72 kids in the Bridger neighborhood program who would graduate out and not be in long-term numbers. And Sarah is suggesting that PPS should provide more research on split feeders and their impact on students.
Split feeders aren't ideal. I know that's not the research, but I can tell you as a principal who's been in K-8s and K-5s, if you can avoid split feeders, it's better.
Who wants to speak in the big group?
I don't, but one thing I want to say before we get sucked back is I wish that we weren't always pressed for time. It feels like every single meeting like this, there's too much shoved into too short of a time, and then it starts to feel panicky. And I don't think that people make their best decisions